Over several months, CityNews has investigated your airline issues and your air passenger rights. Your stories have ranged from a musician who was threatened to be kicked off a Toronto-bound flight if he didn't pay to have his guitar checked as extra baggage, to Air Canada quietly extending the length their aircraft can remain grounded on a tarmac before you have a right to disembark. Finding out what you can be compensated for can be a long, complicated process. The Canadian Transportation Agency says they now get about 6,000 complaints every single year. Now, today, the CTA was hosting the first of several Canada-wide public consultations. They're getting ready to roll out the federal government's new Modernization Transportation Act. They say they want to hear from you, passengers, to help create base standards that all Canadian carriers will have to adhere to.
Up until now, it's been individual tariffs. Each airline has set out its own terms and conditions of carriage. In the areas where we create regulations, there's going to be a common floor, and it will apply to every airline flying passengers within, to, or from Canada.
CTA CEO Scott Striner shook many hands ahead of today's public consultation that our cameras were not allowed to film. He claims that one of the only ways passengers have been able to find recourse when they have an issue flying is in the fine print of a lengthy tariff.
I think it's critical that travelers actually know where they can turn for recourse. So we at the CTA have the ability to mediate and to adjudicate allegations from travelers that an airline hasn't respected its obligations.
Though passenger rights advocates say there's already protection in place under the Carriage by Air Act that incorporates the Montreal Convention into Canadian law. They say enforcement by the CTA is the big issue, and some believe today's consultation and the ones to follow in the days and weeks ahead across the country are nothing more than a PR stunt.
This is a publicity stunt to legitimize what has already been decided by the airlines and the government in secret meetings that took place last year. We found out about those secret consultations from court documents from the Supreme Court of Canada.
I believe that the legislation has not created a passenger Bill of Rights, but created an airline Bill of Rights. So we've been sold down.
Richard Brown flies extensively for work and spoke at today's consultation. He believes the new legislation will actually give airlines an out, that they can claim mechanical issues whenever there's a problem. He says an 8-hour Air Canada delay resulted in little action from the CTA.
I don't think CTA has ever gone to bat for the passengers. It's been in the pocket of airlines for years.
And you fear that with this new legislation it could only get worse?
It'll definitely only get worse. We're letting the fox into the hen house.
What do you say to someone who might be critical of the CTA and says you haven't enforced the guidelines and principles that have already been established?
We have a long record of making our decisions based on the facts and the law, and strongly defending the interests of all parties. These new regulations are going to help ensure that we strengthen air passenger rights and that people know what their rights are and who they can turn to for recourse. The public consultations continue this evening here at the Sheridan Centre on Queen Street. Now, we'll get a good idea of just how fair the new legislation is going to be once it's finalized in the months ahead. The public consultations will be heading out west. They'll be going to Vancouver, Calgary, Yellowknife before circling back east and wrapping up in Ottawa next month. Ahead on City News, we're going to have more on the Sunwing investigation. We now have learned there have been hundreds of complaints from passengers about 24 flights over just 5 days in April. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Scott Striner, the chair.
Earlier on City News, we told you about the Canadian Transportation Agency's public consultations taking place today at the Sheridan Centre downtown. And this evening, passengers have been airing their issues about Canadian carriers as the CTA gets set to roll out its new Modernization Transportation Act. Now, back in April, over just a 5-day period, there were multiple complaints from passengers who boarded 23 different Sunwing flights. Well, today we had a chance to speak with the man who's chairing the panel that's looking into those complaints. While he couldn't speak to specifics, he did admit that the amount of complaints over just that 5-day period have gone up from about 80 to several hundred.
We've assigned an investigator, an inquiry officer, and he has received information from numerous passengers, which he's now going to be summarizing and putting into a report for the panel looking at the case.
We have about 500 complaints from passengers who are on those flights, and they touch 80 different flights. So this is a fairly big inquiry. Once the panel receives the report from the inquiry officer, we'll consider next steps and ultimately get to a ruling.
Is it fair to say that this is the largest inquiry, 80 flights that the CTA has ever had to undertake?
Certainly it's the largest inquiry in my time at the CTA, the last 3 years, and I think it's the largest, or certainly one of the largest inquiries in our history. Now, keep in mind, Adrian, we've been around 114 years, so I don't want to say absolutely that there's never been an inquiry this big, but it's a big inquiry.
You guys are understaffed, and it's your fault. We want full refunds.
We want to get to the bottom of what happened and help to ensure that if there were situations that could have been avoided, that it doesn't happen again.
It's expected that the officer looking into the investigation will have his or her report done by the end of the year. And air travel in Canada isn't getting a stellar rating. In a new ranking of the world's best and worst airlines and airports, Canadian Airlines ranked 40th, 41st, and 44th. Full details are available on citynews.ca.